Hello, friends. I'm glad you're here. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? I always find it fascinating, imagining all of you scattered across the quiet corners of the world. Each of you somewhere different, but sharing this same moment of stillness. Now, let's step back in time. Far back, to a world of stone walls, candlelight, and whispers that echoed through cold corridors. Tonight, we enter a place where time almost stopped, a monastery hidden deep in the green folds of medieval Europe. And there we will meet a man who chose silence as his companion, and found that even silence has a voice. His name was Brother Aelric. When he first arrived at the monastery gates, he was no older than 20. The sun had not yet risen that morning. A pale mist lay upon the fields, and the dew turned every blade of grass into a trembling bead of glass. His sandals were worn through from walking for days. Behind him lay the noise of the world, the clatter of towns, the drunken laughter of taverns, the cries of merchants, all fading into the distance. Ahead of him rose the monastery walls, dark and still, like the sides of a mountain. The great wooden doors were closed. He knocked once. The sound echoed like thunder in the cold morning air. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, a small hatch opened, and a single pair of eyes appeared, calm, unreadable. A voice said softly, "What do you seek?" Aelric answered, as he had been taught, "Peace." The eyes watched him for a moment longer, and then the door creaked open. Inside, the world changed. He stepped into a courtyard paved with uneven stones, wet with mist. The air smelled of incense, smoke, and freshly cut herbs. Bells were ringing somewhere, not loud, but steady, like a heartbeat. Monks in dark robes passed silently between the cloisters, each carrying a small wooden lamp. None of them spoke. None even looked at him directly. It was as if he had walked into a dream where the rules of speech and movement were entirely different. A tall man in a white cowl approached the prior. His face was kind but grave, like a statue carved from old wood. He placed a hand on Aelric's shoulder and led him forward. There was no welcome, no ceremony. Only motion. Steps upon stone. The monastery was waking, or perhaps it had never slept. The day began before dawn. It always did. Aelric followed the others to the chapel, a long narrow room lit by flickering candles. The monks knelt on the cold floor. The air was heavy with wax and prayer. And then from the shadows the chant began, low voices rising and falling in unison, ancient Latin words flowing like the rhythm of the sea. It was beautiful and endless. Aelric did not yet know the meaning of the words, but he felt their weight. Each sound seemed to press against his chest like a stone. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. When the chanting stopped, the monks rose and filed out without a word. Aelric followed, dazed, his knees stiff, his heart strangely light. He had stepped out of the world of men and into another world entirely, one that moved by its own rules. The monastery was not large, but it felt infinite. There were passageways that twisted like veins through the building, staircases that led to nowhere, doors that were always locked. In one corner, the smell of baking bread; in another, the faint metallic tang of ink. Outside, the sound of a stream. Somewhere far below, a bell marking the hours. Brother Aelric was led to his cell, a small stone room with a straw bed, a wooden cross, and nothing else. A single window looked out over the fields. It was too high to see through, except for a square of sky. He knelt there for a long time, just listening. For the first time in years, there was no noise, no voice, no demand. Only silence. And in that silence, he began to hear things he had never noticed before. The whisper of his own breathing, the faint hum of the building, the heartbeat in his ears. He did not yet know that silence can be both a friend and an enemy. At mealtime, the monks gathered in the refectory. Long wooden tables stretched beneath arches blackened by smoke. They ate in silence while one monk read aloud from a sacred text. Aelric tasted bread and soup, simple, flavorless, but filling. He dared not look around too much. The discipline of stillness was strange to him, and yet, he felt something stirring deep inside, a sense of belonging or perhaps surrender. When the meal ended, a bell rang, and all stood at once, bowed, and left without a sound. Aelric followed, his mind filled with questions he could not ask. Later, he was shown the scriptorium, a long bright hall where the monks copied texts by hand. The smell of parchment and lamp oil filled the air. He watched as the brothers bent over their desks, their quills scratching softly, each movement deliberate. Their faces were pale, their eyes calm. It was said that every letter they wrote was an act of prayer. That night, Aelric lay awake on his straw bed. The monastery was silent except for the wind brushing through the cloisters. He thought of the outside world, of his mother's cottage, of rain on the thatched roof, of his father's rough hands. He wondered if they would ever know where he had gone. He closed his eyes and tried to pray, but all he could think about was the endless sound of that morning chant, echoing in his skull. In the darkness, he felt something else, not fear exactly, but a strange awareness. As though the monastery itself was alive, watching him, breathing softly in its sleep. He would learn in time that the walls held more than prayers. They held memories and secrets. The next morning, Aelric woke to the sound of the bell. It was still dark outside, that hour before dawn when the air feels heavy, and even the stars seem to hesitate. The bell rang again, slow and deep, echoing through the stone corridors. It was a sound that reached not just the ears, but the bones. He sat up, disoriented. For a moment, he had forgotten where he was. Then he remembered, the monastery, the vow, the silence. The straw rustled beneath him as he rose and pulled on his robe. The floor was cold, the air colder still. His breath drifted like smoke in the darkness. When he opened his cell door, the hallway was already alive with shadows moving silently toward the chapel. No one spoke. They glided past like ghosts, their sandals whispering against the flagstones. Aelric followed, clutching his wooden rosary. In the chapel, the candles had been lit. The monks knelt, their faces pale in the wavering light. Then, one voice began the matins, the first prayer of the day. The chant rose, slow and solemn, each note perfectly measured. The air seemed to vibrate with devotion. Aelric's lips moved, but he did not yet know the words. Still, he felt something, a rhythm older than memory itself. The chant was not just a song, it was a heartbeat, steady and eternal. After matins came lauds, then prime. Hours passed, though no one marked them. There was no clock here, only bells and breath and the slow turning of light through the windows. Later, the monks filed into the chapter house. The abbot sat at the front, an old man with thin silver hair and eyes as still as water. His voice, when he spoke, was soft, but every word carried weight. He opened a small book, the Rule of Saint Benedict. Aelric had heard of it before, but never listened closely. Now he would live by it. The abbot read aloud. "Let there be nothing harsh, nothing burdensome. But if a little strictness results, it is for the correction of vices and the preservation of charity." The words were plain, but they struck deep. Every breath of life in the monastery followed this rule, from when to speak, to when to eat, to how to walk. Even silence was not emptiness here, it was an act of obedience. Aelric soon learned the rhythm of the day. At sunrise, they prayed. At mid-morning, they worked, sweeping corridors, tending gardens, mending robes. At noon, they prayed again. At dusk, more prayers, then a simple meal, and silence until dawn. The silence was the hardest part. Outside these walls, Aelric had spoken freely, laughed, sung, argued, even shouted. Here, words were rare, precious things. He could only speak with permission from the abbot, and only for necessary matters. Days passed without a single spoken word. At first, the quiet pressed down on him like a weight. He tried to fill it with thoughts, with prayers, with memories. But eventually, the silence began to change him. He started to hear things he never noticed before: the drip of water from a stone arch, the creak of wood when the wind blew through the cloister, the slow ticking of his own heart. One evening, during the great silence, he walked through the cloister garden alone. The sky was dark blue, heavy with clouds, and the first snow of winter was beginning to fall. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Every sound was softened by the snow, even his footsteps. He passed the herb garden, where rows of sage and lavender slept beneath frost. A candle flickered in one of the upper windows, the scriptorium perhaps, where an older monk was still at work. For a moment, Aelric felt that the candle was watching him, not the other way around. He knelt beside the fountain at the center of the courtyard and closed his eyes. The water murmured softly, like a voice beneath the surface of thought. In that moment, something inside him quieted. The silence was no longer an enemy. It was like being underwater, still, weightless, free from the noise of the world. The next morning, he began his work in earnest. The abbot assigned him to the kitchen for a week. It was a place of heat and motion: copper pots, bread rising in stone ovens, the scent of onions and smoke. The cook, Brother Gervas, was old and round, with eyes like warm embers. He never spoke, but he smiled often, and his silence seemed filled with kindness. They worked side by side, communicating with gestures. When Aelric made mistakes, Gervas corrected him with a soft nod or a raised eyebrow. By the end of the week, Aelric could sense what the old monk wanted before he even moved his hand. It was as though silence had sharpened his awareness. The following week, he was moved to the gardens. There, under the gray sky, he learned the names of every plant: valerian, thyme, rosemary, hyssop. The scent of earth clung to his hands, and when he prayed that night, the smell of soil and roots stayed with him. But the monastery was not all peace. There was tension beneath the surface: unspoken rivalries, subtle glances, whispered rumors that never reached words. Once, while sweeping near the cloister, he saw two monks standing in the corner, their faces close, their gestures sharp. When they noticed him, they stepped apart and bowed, too quickly. Aelric wondered what they had been saying, or not saying. Every Sunday, after Mass, the monks gathered again in the chapter house to confess faults aloud. Each one knelt and admitted his mistakes before the abbot, falling asleep during prayer, speaking without permission, eating too much bread. When Aelric's turn came, he hesitated. He could think of many things: pride, doubt, fear. But he said only, "I have been distracted in prayer." The abbot nodded slowly. "Distraction," he said, "is the doorway to temptation. Guard your thoughts, Brother Aelric, for the enemy enters through the mind." Those words stayed with him. He began to watch his thoughts carefully, as though they were wild animals. At night, as the wind howled outside, he would lie awake, counting his breaths, trying not to think. Yet sometimes, in the dark, his mind wandered. He would remember the faces of people he had left behind, the laughter of his childhood, the feeling of sunlight on open fields. He wondered whether it was a sin to miss those things. And sometimes he felt something else, a presence, faint but near, as if someone stood just beyond his door. Once he opened it and found the corridor empty, only the flickering torchlight dancing along the walls. But the feeling lingered, a quiet reminder that silence is never truly empty. Weeks turned into months. The rhythm of the monastery became his heartbeat. Bells, prayer, work, silence. again and again. He began to forget the world outside. And yet, deep in the stillness of his soul, a small quiet question took root. What lies beyond obedience? It would be years before he found an answer. Time inside the monastery did not flow like time in the outside world. It did not rush forward or drift away. It turned in slow, measured circles, each hour folding into the next, like waves lapping endlessly at the same quiet shore. Brother Aelric learned that the monks did not mark their days by the sun or the seasons, but by prayer. Prayer was the pulse of life here, the invisible clock that governed everything. Each moment had its name, its sound, its duty, the rhythm of the divine office, the sacred cycle that bound heaven to earth. It began before dawn, with matins, the dark prayer. The bell would toll through the blackness, low and deep, calling them from sleep. Aelric would rise from his straw bed, feeling the chill stone under his bare feet. He would join the line of silent figures moving toward the chapel, their lamps bobbing like faint stars in the corridor. In the chapel, the air was thick with incense and breath. The monks knelt in 2 rows, their voices rising and falling in chant. The words were old, older than the walls, older than any one of them. Domini, labia mea aperis. O Lord, open thou my lips. The chant rolled through the dark like a tide, and as the candles flickered, Aelric sometimes imagined that the sound came not from human mouths but from the stones themselves, singing through them. When matins ended, the monks remained kneeling as the faintest gray touched the high windows. That was lauds, the prayer of dawn. It was gentler, filled with hope, praising the coming of light. By then the air was cold and sharp, and Aelric could see his breath drift upward with each word, mingling with the incense like a visible prayer. After lauds came prime, marking the first true hour of the day. The bell rang again, and they filed out for simple work, sweeping, cleaning, carrying water from the stream. The light of morning crept slowly across the courtyard, and for a few moments, the world felt almost normal again. Then came terce, sext, and none, mid-morning, midday, mid-afternoon, each one dividing the day like chapters in a book. Every prayer had its melody, its rhythm. The voices never changed, but the light did. Morning gold turned to the bright glare of noon, and then to the softer hues of evening. By the time they reached vespers, the chapel glowed with amber light. Shadows stretched long across the floor, and the candles cast halos on the old wooden beams. Finally, there was Compline, the night prayer, the closing of the circle. It was the gentlest of all. The chant was slow, full of longing and peace. When it ended, no one spoke again until dawn. Aelric soon began to lose sense of ordinary time. Days blended together like ink spilled on parchment. He could no longer say which was Monday or Thursday, or how many weeks had passed since his arrival. The only true reality was the next bell, the next prayer, the next silence. At first, this frightened him. Then, it began to comfort him. To live by the hours of prayer was to be carried by something larger, a rhythm that did not depend on him at all. He began to understand what the abbot meant when he said, "A monk's time belongs to God." But even in this perfect order, small moments of humanity broke through. Once during sext, as the sun burned high and the heat filled the chapel, Aelric glanced up and saw Brother Thomas, a young monk with kind eyes, struggling to stay awake. His head drooped forward, then jerked upright again. Their eyes met for a moment, and a flicker of silent laughter passed between them before they both lowered their gaze. It was forbidden to smile during prayer, but in that small secret instant, Aelric felt less alone. Another time, during vespers, a sparrow flew through an open window and landed on the altar rail. It hopped once, twice, then fluttered away, leaving a single feather behind. No one moved or spoke, but every pair of eyes followed it. Afterward, as they filed out, Aelric saw the old abbot pick up the feather and tuck it into his sleeve. It struck Aelric that even here, behind stone walls, the world still found its way in. When not praying, the monks worked, in the fields, the kitchens, the scriptorium. But even labor was an extension of prayer. As they tilled the soil or copied a text, they murmured psalms under their breath. Every action, no matter how small, was part of the same offering. At night, when Compline ended, Aelric would return to his cell, exhausted yet strangely serene. The silence felt alive, humming faintly with the echoes of chant. Sometimes he would lie on his bed and listen, to the distant drip of water, to the wind sighing through cracks in the stone, to the soft creak of the beams. He began to sense that silence was not emptiness at all. It was filled with unseen motion, like the sea beneath the surface. Once, during a storm, the thunder rolled so close that it shook the windows. Lightning flared through the chapel during matins, turning the faces of the monks ghost-white for an instant. Aelric felt a thrill of fear and awe. He thought of the psalm they were chanting, "The voice of the Lord breaketh the cedars," and wondered whether the storm itself was a kind of divine voice. But storms passed, and the rhythm continued. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. Like the turning of a great wheel, it never stopped. The monotony should have dulled his spirit, yet somehow it sharpened it instead. His thoughts became clearer, his senses keener. He began to see small things he had never noticed before, the way dust swirled in sunlight like tiny worlds in motion, the faint crack in a wall shaped like a cross, the slow blooming of a flower by the well. In this repetition, he found revelation. Still, there were moments when his mind wandered. During the long pauses between prayers, when the silence stretched thin, he would sometimes imagine voices, faint, almost like echoes. He thought he heard whispering in the cloister when no one was there. Once, he even turned and saw a shadow vanish around a corner, though the corridor was empty. Perhaps it was only the wind. Perhaps not. The monastery had its secrets. He could feel them, even if no one spoke of them. And yet, despite the mystery and the strangeness, Aelric felt a slow transformation within himself. The noise of the outside world had faded completely. The memories of markets, laughter, arguments, all seemed distant now, like a story told about someone else. He was beginning to forget who he had been before. And in losing himself, he was beginning to find something else. Something deeper. One evening, after Compline, he lingered in the chapel alone. The last candle was burning low, its flame trembling in the still air. He knelt before the altar, eyes closed, and felt the vast silence around him, not empty but waiting. He whispered, almost without meaning to, "Speak, Lord. I am listening." But the silence gave no answer. Only the soft flutter of a moth near the candle flame, and the faint toll of the bell, marking another hour in eternity. By his second year within the monastery walls, Brother Aelric had grown into the rhythm of the hours so completely that he no longer needed the bell. He could feel the changes in the day within himself, the subtle shift in the air before matins, the faint warmth that reached his cell just before lauds. Each prayer, each silence, each breath was woven into his being. It was then that the abbot called him to the scriptorium. The summons came quietly, as all things did here. After prime, a young novice placed a small slip of parchment on Aelric's table. There were only 4 words written on it in a steady, angular hand: "Come to the scriptorium." Aelric felt a chill, a mixture of fear and reverence. The scriptorium was the monastery's most sacred place of labor, a workshop of words, where the very voice of God was copied by human hands. Few were chosen to work there. Those who did seemed changed by it, their eyes pale from years of candlelight, their movements slow and precise as though they feared to disturb the air. The door of the scriptorium was heavy oak, bound with black iron. When Aelric pushed it open, a wave of scent met him, lamp oil, wax, and the dry sweetness of parchment. The room was long, its narrow windows letting in cold light from the north, so that no shadow would fall upon the pages. Along the walls, rows of desks stood like pews in a chapel. At each sat a monk, bent over a manuscript, his quill whispering against the page. The master scribe, Brother Anselm, raised his head as Aelric entered. His face was thin, his eyes rimmed with red. "Sit there," he murmured, pointing to an empty desk near the window. "You'll begin with illumination." Aelric bowed and obeyed. Before him lay a sheet of vellum so smooth it shone faintly, and beside it a small dish of powdered pigment, red made from crushed cinnabar, blue from lapis, gold from leaf so thin it trembled with each breath. Brother Anselm spoke again, barely louder than the scratching of pens. "Every letter you write is a prayer. Every mistake, a sin. Every page, an offering." Then he turned back to his work, and the room fell once more into its sacred silence. Aelric dipped his quill into ink and drew his first careful line. The quill moved slowly, its tip cutting a faint groove into the parchment. The sound was soft, rhythmic, hypnotic, the same sound that had filled this room for centuries. Hours passed. The light changed from gray to gray again, but Aelric barely noticed. His whole world was contained in the small space of that page. Each curve of a letter, each stroke of color felt like breathing. But as he copied the sacred text, his mind began to wander. On the page before him, among the shining capitals and tiny black letters, he noticed faint scratches, not part of the text, but something else. At first he thought they were mistakes, but when he looked closer, he saw that they formed tiny shapes, a bird drawn in the margin. Its wings were folded, its beak open as if singing. Later, on another page, he found a single word hidden between lines: remember. He said nothing of it to anyone. Yet he could not stop thinking about the hands that had written it, some monk long dead, leaving behind a trace of rebellion in the very heart of obedience. As the days passed, Aelric's curiosity grew. During the hours of labor, he kept his eyes lowered. But when Brother Anselm turned his back, Aelric's gaze wandered over the shelves that lined the far wall. There were hundreds of volumes, some new, others so old their bindings had turned black. He could almost hear them breathing, the quiet weight of all that was written, all that was hidden. Once, when Anselm sent him to fetch more vellum from the storage room, Aelric saw a small door at the back of the chamber, half concealed by a hanging tapestry. It was locked. The keyhole was rimmed with dust. That night, he dreamed of it. In his dream, the door stood open, and behind it lay not another room but a corridor leading downward, deeper than the earth itself. He heard voices chanting, not in Latin, not in any tongue he knew, and in the rhythm of the chant, his own name. When he woke, his heart was racing, his fingers stained with ink that should not have been there. The next morning, he went to Brother Anselm and confessed his unease. "I think too much as I work," he said softly. Anselm smiled without looking up. "All scribes think too much. The trick is not to let the ink know it." So Aelric returned to his desk, pretending to be calm. Yet as he copied line after line, he found more strange marks, tiny faces drawn in the corners of pages, symbols scratched beneath the text, even a faint line of verse written in the smallest possible hand. He who writes remembers the world he left. It was as if the books themselves were whispering to him. One evening, after Vespers, when the candles burned low and the others had gone to the refectory, Aelric lingered behind. The scriptorium was empty now, except for the faint glow of embers and the rustle of parchment shifting as it cooled. He opened one of the old books at random. Its cover was cracked and dark, the writing faded almost to invisibility. As he turned the pages, a faint scent of dust and rosewater rose into the air, a smell of age and memory. Then he saw it. Between two leaves pressed flat, was a small scrap of paper. On it, written in careful, deliberate script, were the words, "There is another library." He froze. For a long time he sat there, staring at the words, listening to his own heartbeat echo in the silence. The candles flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw a shadow move across the far wall, slow, human-shaped, though there was no one there. He slipped the note into his sleeve and left the room, closing the door behind him. That night, he could not sleep. The wind moaned through the cloisters, carrying the scent of rain. He turned the note over and over in his hands. Another library? What could that mean? In the stillness, he remembered the locked door behind the tapestry. He rose from his bed, barefoot, the cold stone biting at his feet. The corridor outside was empty, the lamps burning low. He moved quietly, the folds of his robe whispering like wings. When he reached the scriptorium, the door opened with a slow groan. Inside, the room was black except for the faint red of dying embers. He crossed to the tapestry. The air behind it was colder, stale. His fingers found the edge of the door. He pulled, locked. He pressed his ear against it. Nothing. Then, just as he turned to leave, he heard something, a faint sound deep within. Not quite a voice. More like a sigh. He stepped back, heart pounding, and the silence swallowed the sound again. Aelric returned to his cell before the next bell, the scrap of paper still hidden in his sleeve. He lay awake until matins, the word echoing in his mind like a whisper from another world. Another library. He did not yet know that the words would haunt him for years, drawing him towards secrets the monastery had buried long before he was born. And when he finally found that hidden place, he would wish he never had. The monastery's garden was a world apart. When Brother Aelric first began tending it, he thought it would be a place of rest, a space to forget the endless hours of ink and vellum, the ache of sitting hunched over words that were not his own. But it was not rest he found there. It was a different kind of mystery. The garden lay within the inner cloister, surrounded by stone walls and open arches. Through those arches, the wind carried the smell of thyme, mint, and damp earth. The monks called it Hortus Animae, the garden of the soul. Every morning after prime, Brother Aelric would walk there with a wicker basket and a small knife, gathering herbs for the infirmary and the refectory. He moved slowly, with care. The abbot often said that each plant was a word in God's secret language, and that to pluck one thoughtlessly was like interrupting a prayer. So Aelric listened as he worked. He learned the sounds of growing things, the hush of leaves when the wind rose, the slow dripping of dew, the faint hum of bees around the lavender. Sometimes, he thought he could hear more. Beneath the ordinary sounds, there was something quieter, something living and watchful. The same silence that filled the chapel after Compline lived here, too, but in a different form. It was not the silence of discipline or obedience, but the silence of the earth itself, vast and patient. Aelric had begun tending the garden at Brother Oswald's request. Oswald was the oldest monk in the monastery, thin as a reed, his hands knotted with age, his eyes pale and far-seeing. He had spent 40 years in the garden, and it showed. He moved like a part of it, his steps making no sound on the soil. "Everything you need to know," Oswald had told him on that first morning, "is buried here. The trick is knowing how to listen." So Aelric listened. He learned to tell time by the opening of flowers, to predict rain from the stillness of the leaves. He learned that mint grew best where it could hear the sound of water, and that marigolds, when bruised, released a scent that frightened away pests. And yet, even here, among the whispering herbs and gentle sunlight, Aelric could not shake the unease that had begun to root itself in him. The note he had found in the scriptorium was never far from his thoughts. There is another library. He had not told anyone about it. But more than once he caught Brother Oswald watching him, not unkindly, but with a gaze that seemed to weigh what he carried within. One day, as they worked side by side, Oswald spoke suddenly, his voice as rough as bark. "You've been dreaming again," he said. Aelric froze. How do you know that? Oswald smiled faintly. Because your eyes look at things that aren't there. He pressed his hand into the soil. This place has a way of calling to those who listen too closely. You hear something, don't you? Aelric hesitated. The air between them was heavy with the smell of sage. I don't know, he said finally. Sometimes I think I hear voices. Not with my ears, deeper than that. Beneath the ground, perhaps. Or behind the walls. Oswald nodded, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Then you're beginning to understand. He bent down, brushed away a patch of soil, and revealed a small flat stone, its surface carved with faint lines, a circle surrounded by strange marks. They were old, worn by rain and time. This, he said, is older than the monastery. They say it was once part of a pagan altar. When the brothers built the cloister, they used what stones they could find. But not everything was forgotten. He replaced the soil gently and stood. There are layers to this place, Brother Aelric. Like pages in a book. The newest words are not always the truest. Aelric felt a chill, though the sun was warm on his neck. What do you mean? Oswald looked toward the church tower rising above the walls. The abbey was built upon something older. A library, yes, but not one of books. Aelric's heart quickened. You know of it, then? The other library. For a long time, Oswald did not answer. The only sound was the buzzing of bees and the whisper of wind over stone. Then he said quietly, some say it still exists, beneath the cloisters. But the doors were sealed long ago, after the Black Winter. The Black Winter. Oswald's face grew distant. 100 years ago. The year the sun did not rise for 40 days, and the snow turned red with ash. Many died, even within these walls. The brothers said they had angered heaven, that they had read what was not meant to be read. When the thaw came, they bricked the passages shut and swore never to speak of it again. Aelric stared at him. But what could they have read? Oswald met his gaze, his voice little more than a whisper. Not the word of God, but something that looked like it. He turned away then, returning to his herbs as if the conversation were over. Aelric said nothing more, but his thoughts were burning. That night, after Compline, he walked once more through the cloister. The moon hung low, a pale coin in the mist. The stones beneath his feet were damp, shining faintly. He paused by the well at the garden's edge, the same well from which they drew water for the kitchen. Its rim was slick with moss, and when he leaned over it, he could see only darkness below. He dropped a pebble, waited. The echo came late, faint and hollow. Too deep for a garden well. He felt something stir beneath him. Not a sound, not a movement, but a kind of awareness, vast and cold, like an eye opening in the dark. He stumbled back, heart racing. And then faintly he heard it, the same whisper he had heard behind the locked door of the scriptorium. It spoke only one word. Aelric. He fled to his cell, his breath shaking. Yet as he lay there through the night, his fear began to twist into wonder. For the first time, he was certain of it, the monastery was alive. It was not merely built upon history. It was built upon something that still remembered. Something that somehow remembered him. The whisper did not leave him. Through the days that followed, Brother Aelric carried on with his duties as though nothing had changed. Copying psalms in the scriptorium, tending herbs in the garden, kneeling with the others during prayer. But in the quiet between hours, when the wind slipped through the arches and the candles trembled, he could almost hear it again. That voice, distant yet close, like breath on the back of his neck. Aelric. He had never told anyone his dreams, not even in confession. He feared that to speak them aloud might make them real. But now, Silence felt dangerous too, as if something hidden waited only for him to listen. The well became his obsession. Each morning, when the other brothers went to the refectory, Aelric lingered in the garden. He studied the stones that lined the well's mouth, old, uneven, slick with moss. In daylight it looked harmless enough, but he could feel the cold rising from it, as though it breathed. One afternoon, he found Brother Oswald beside the well, sorting bundles of rosemary. The old man's eyes lifted, amused. "You've been haunting this place, Aelric. Tell me, what do you hope to find at the bottom?" Aelric hesitated. "How deep does it go?" Oswald smiled faintly. "Deeper than you think. They say the first monks found it already here when they came to build. An older people carved it from the rock. Perhaps Romans, perhaps even before them. There are bones down there, not all of them from animals." Aelric tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "And you believe that?" Oswald shrugged. "Belief is a strange thing. Some say water remembers. I've wondered if the well remembers too." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "There's something I should show you." From his robe, he drew a small wooden token, a circle carved with the same pattern Aelric had once seen beneath the soil, a ring of marks, half faded by age. "This," Oswald said, "was given to me by my master, who tended this garden before me. He said it was once a seal, a mark of those who kept watch over what lies beneath. The symbol appears again, below the cloister floor. You'll see it if you look carefully where the flagstones change color." Aelric took the token, his fingers trembling. The wood was warm, as if it held a heartbeat. Oswald placed a hand on his shoulder. "Be careful, brother. Curiosity is a blessed gift, until it leads you to doors that should not open." That night, the whisper returned. He had fallen asleep at his desk in the scriptorium, his head resting beside a page half filled with lettering. When he woke, the lamps had gone out, and the air was thick with cold. Only the faint red glow of embers remained. He was not alone. From the far end of the room came a soft scraping sound, like parchment shifting, or perhaps a foot dragging across stone. He sat very still. The sound came again, closer now, deliberate. Aelric. It was not the voice of any man he knew. It was quieter, older, like a word spoken from deep within the earth. He rose slowly, the floor creaking beneath him, and turned toward the tapestry at the back of the room. The faintest light flickered beneath it, as though a candle burned behind the wall. His pulse thundered in his ears. He lifted the tapestry. The small door stood there, locked as before. Yet now he could see, faintly, just above the keyhole, the same carved symbol that marked the token in his pocket. The wood around it was cold and slick to the touch, though the air was still. He pressed his palm against it. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, from the other side, came a single knock. He stumbled backward, heart hammering, and the candlelight vanished. The room was dark again, the silence absolute. By morning, he convinced himself he had dreamed it. The fatigue, the dimness, the long hours of work, surely that was all. Yet when he returned later that day, he found the lock on the door smeared with something dark, like soot or dried ink. And the symbol above it was gone. Days passed. He avoided the scriptorium at night, though his thoughts never strayed far from it. The token Oswald had given him weighed heavy in his robe. He began to notice strange things, the faint vibration beneath the floor of the cloister during prayer, a low humming that no one else seemed to hear. Sometimes, when he drew water from the well, the bucket came up warm, though the mornings were cold. Once, he leaned over the rim again, staring into the dark water below. His reflection trembled, not with his movement, but with something beneath. Ripples moved outward, as though disturbed from below. Then, for the briefest instant, another face appeared beside his own, pale, eyeless, and gone before he could breathe. He nearly dropped the bucket. That night, unable to sleep, Aelric slipped from his cell and made his way to the cloister. The moon was bright, painting the stone floor silver. The monastery slept. He knelt and ran his hands over the flagstones, just as Oswald had told him. Most were smooth and gray, but near the center of the cloister, where the old well's shadow fell, one stone was darker, ringed faintly by that same carved circle. The air there was colder, almost humming. He pressed his ear to the floor. At first he heard only his own heartbeat. Then, faintly, the sound of water, distant, deep. But beneath it, another sound took shape. It was not a voice, not exactly, more like many voices overlapping, whispering in rhythm, too soft to understand. They were chanting. He couldn't make out the words, but the pattern was unmistakable, a litany, an echo of prayer. Only this prayer was wrong. The rhythm twisted, faltering and turning back on itself, like something written by a trembling hand. He lifted his head, breath shaking, and realized that the dark stone was slightly loose. His fingers dug at the edges. It moved a little, grinding against the others, and beneath it, a breath of cool air rose from below. He stopped. The voices went silent, as if they too were listening. Aelric stood slowly and backed away, his knees weak. He knew that if he lifted that stone, something would change forever, and yet deep within him, he knew he would return. It was Brother Oswald. But something was wrong. His posture was too still, his face hidden. The moonlight glinted on his hands, which were clasped before him as if in prayer. "Aelric," he said softly. And then he smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "Don't open it." The words hung in the air long after the figure had vanished. Aelric stood alone in the pale moonlight, the cold stone under his hand, and the whisper of the well calling to him from beneath. He knew now, whatever waited below the monastery was not just old. It was awake. For 3 nights, Brother Aelric tried to resist the pull. He prayed longer than before, fasted more strictly, worked until his hands bled upon the parchment. He told himself that the vision of Oswald in the moonlight had been a dream, that the whispering beneath the stone was nothing more than the wind caught between cracks of old masonry. But the thought would not leave him. It followed him into every hour, through matins, through lauds, even through the soft chanting of the psalms. The well, the locked door, the dark stone in the cloister floor, they haunted him like unfinished words on a page. By the 4th night, the struggle ended. Something deeper than will drew him on, something like fate, or perhaps memory. When the monastery fell asleep, he rose from his cell and slipped into the corridor, carrying a single candle. His bare feet made no sound on the cold floor. Outside, the night was silent but for the faint dripping of water somewhere far away. The cloister lay empty beneath the moon. The garden beyond shimmered faintly with dew. He knelt again beside the dark stone. The symbol, that faint ring of markings, glowed silver in the candlelight. He ran his fingers over it, tracing the grooves, feeling the old strange energy humming beneath. The stone moved easily this time. It was as though it had been waiting for him. Beneath it yawned a black opening, narrow but deep, the smell of dust and damp rising from below. Steps led downward, carved from rock itself, spiraling into darkness. Aelric hesitated, the flame of his candle trembling. He could feel the weight of centuries pressing up from below, the breath of forgotten prayers, of voices long silenced. He whispered a brief blessing under his breath and descended. The air grew colder with each step, thick with the scent of earth and iron. The walls closed around him, slick with moisture. His candle cast long, shifting shadows that seemed to move even when he stood still. After a time, though he could not say how long, the stairway opened into a small chamber. Its ceiling was low, its walls carved smooth. There were no windows, no doors, only a single stone altar in the center and a dozen clay lamps set around it, long extinguished. And yet, the chamber was not silent. A low sound pulsed through it, like a heartbeat. It came from the altar. Aelric stepped closer. On the stone surface, worn by time, were carvings, not in Latin, not in any language he knew. Lines and circles intertwined like roots or veins, forming shapes that seemed to shift when he looked too long. He placed his hand upon it. The stone was warm. And then he heard it, faint but unmistakable, the whisper. The same voice that had called his name. Only now it was clearer. It spoke not in words, but in understanding, a message that entered his mind directly, bypassing language altogether. It told him things he did not wish to know. He saw images, flashes of the past, of the monastery when it was still new, of monks chanting in this very chamber. He saw the same altar, but open, its top slid aside like a lid. Inside it, bound in iron, lay something that shimmered faintly, like a living light caught within glass. The monks had gathered around it, their faces pale with awe and terror. They were reading, not aloud but silently, as though the light itself spoke the words. One by one, their eyes darkened, their mouths moving in unison. The chanting grew louder until it became a scream. Then, darkness. The vision vanished. Aelric staggered back, gasping, his candle flickering wildly. He realized his hand was bleeding, a small cut across his palm, as if the stone itself had bitten him. He turned to flee, but the way back seemed longer than before. The stair spiraled endlessly upward, the air thick and stifling. His candle guttered, nearly died, then caught again just as he reached the top. The cloister was no longer silent. The wind moaned through the arches, and the garden rustled though no breeze stirred it. When he replaced the stone, he felt a vibration beneath it, a faint, steady rhythm. A heartbeat. From the shadows beyond the archway, a voice spoke. "So," said Brother Oswald, his tone calm, almost sorrowful. "You found it." Aelric turned. Oswald stood there, wrapped in his cloak, his face hidden in shadow. "I had to know," Aelric whispered. "It called to me." Oswald stepped closer, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like wet stone. "And now it will never stop calling." He reached into his sleeve and drew out the wooden token, the one he had given Aelric days before. But it was different now. The carvings upon it burned faintly red, like embers. Oswald placed it on the ground between them. The air grew thick, heavy with something unseen. "You've woken it," he said quietly. "We all knew this day would come again. That's why the passage was sealed after the Black Winter." "What is it?" Aelric demanded. "What's buried here?" Oswald's voice trembled, but not with fear. Knowledge. The kind that remembers itself. They found it centuries ago, a book without words, written in the memory of the earth. It taught them more than any man should know, and it demanded to be read. He looked down, his face lined with sorrow. "Now it will demand the same from you." The token at their feet cracked with a faint sound. A wisp of smoke rose from it, thin and gray, curling like ink dissolving in water. The whisper returned, not from below this time, but all around them. It echoed in the arches, in the leaves of the garden, in the trembling of the candle flame. It spoke Aelric's name again, softer, almost tender. He wanted to flee, to run into the night, but his body would not obey. His heart beat in rhythm with the whisper. And when he looked at Oswald, the old monk was weeping silently. "I tried to warn you," he said, "but once it remembers your name, it never forgets." The candle went out. For a moment, there was only darkness, vast, ancient, living. And in that darkness, Aelric heard a sound like the turning of a page. When dawn came, Brother Aelric did not hear the bell. He woke not to sound, but to silence, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow every thought. For a few moments, he could not remember where he was. The walls of his cell looked strange, somehow changed. The light that filtered through the narrow window was gray, not gold, and the air was colder than it should have been. He rose slowly, his body heavy, his head filled with fog. On the floor beside his bed lay the candle he had carried the night before. Its wick was blackened, though he could not remember dropping it. And beside it, half hidden by the folds of his blanket, was the small wooden token Brother Oswald had held in the cloister. It was cracked through the center. He picked it up, heart beating faster. The carved circle had changed. What had once been a ring of faded marks was now clear, sharp as if freshly cut, and within the circle was a new symbol, a single eye. He turned it over in his hand. The wood felt alive. And when his thumb brushed the carved eye, a vision flickered behind his eyelids, brief but bright. He saw parchment without ink, pages that shimmered faintly as though made of water. And on them shapes moved, not words, but shadows forming sentences too fluid to hold. He saw a table of stone, the same he had touched in the chamber below. Upon it lay a book that was not written, but alive, its pages turning of their own accord, whispering as they moved. Then the vision was gone. He sat for a long while, staring at the token, until the bell for prime broke the morning stillness. The sound startled him. It was the first real sound he had heard since waking. He dressed quickly, though his hands shook, and joined the brothers in the chapel. The chanting was soft, steady, familiar, yet something was wrong. The words seemed to echo in strange ways, folding over themselves, slipping out of rhythm. Aelric glanced at the others, but none seemed to notice. Their faces were serene, eyes closed, mouths moving in unison. When he looked down at his own hands, he froze. Lines were appearing on his skin, faint, dark, like ink seeping through from beneath. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but when he rubbed at them, they did not fade. They were not wounds, nor stains, they were letters. Latin letters. Verbum. The word burned faintly across his palm, the word. He clenched his fist, heart pounding, and the letters vanished. Yet their impression remained, cold against his skin. After the prayers, Brother Oswald found him standing alone by the cloister wall. His face looked older than before, his eyes hollow but kind. "You saw it, didn't you?" the old monk said softly. Aelric hesitated. "I don't know what I saw." Oswald nodded slowly. "That is how it begins." He looked around to be sure they were alone. "Listen carefully, Aelric. What lies beneath this place is not a book in the way you think. It was never meant to be read. It reads us." Aelric frowned. "Reads us." Oswald's gaze was distant, lost in memory. Those who found it believed it was a divine text, the first word, the pure language of creation itself. But the truth was simpler. It was memory. The memory of everything the earth has seen. All that was, all that will be. When they opened it, it looked back. He placed a trembling hand on Aelric's shoulder. "And now, it's found a new reader." Aelric swallowed. "Then how do I stop it?" Oswald gave a small, sad smile. "You don't. You learn to listen without understanding. That's the only way it lets you keep your mind." The words chilled Aelric more than the cold air ever could. That night, he dreamed again. He was standing in the scriptorium, though it was no longer a place of light. The windows were sealed, the air thick with dust. Rows of monks sat at their desks, motionless, their faces pale, their eyes black as ink. Each one held a quill, but they were not writing. The quills were moving on their own, scrawling strange shapes across the pages. As he walked among them, the writing began to crawl. The letters moved like living things, sliding across the parchment, rearranging themselves into new forms. They pulsed with faint light, then rose from the page like smoke. When Aelric looked closer, he realized the shapes were faces, countless faces whispering in a tongue he could almost understand. Then he saw himself sitting among them, head bowed, quill in hand. His own page was blank, except for one faint word written in blood. Remember. He woke with a cry, sweat freezing on his skin. His candle had burned out again, though he hadn't lit it. The cell was pitch dark. And then faintly, from the corner of the room, came the sound of turning pages. He froze, every muscle rigid. The sound continued, slow, deliberate, like a book being read in the dark. Aelric whispered, "Who's there?" The sound stopped. He rose, trembling, and struck flint to light the candle. The flame caught, and in its trembling glow he saw it, a single sheet of parchment lying on the floor. He bent to pick it up. It was blank, except for a faint stain in the center that spread slowly outward, as though ink were blooming beneath the surface. Then letters began to appear, one by one. "Come back." The words faded almost as soon as they formed. He knew then that the thing beneath the monastery, the book without words, had not only awakened. It was calling him again. He turned the parchment over. On the back was the faint impression of a handprint, his own. Aelric waited until the monastery slept. The night had grown heavy, colder than any he remembered. Even the moon seemed dim, veiled behind slow-moving clouds. He moved through the silent corridors barefoot, holding his candle close, its light shivering against the walls. The token with the carved eye hung around his neck now, warm against his chest as though it had a pulse. The way to the crypts was familiar. Too familiar. Each time he descended the stone steps, the air seemed thicker, the smell of the earth stronger. He passed the alcoves where the bones of long-dead brothers lay, their faces hidden behind carved slabs of stone. He whispered a prayer as he went, though his voice trembled. When he reached the great sealed door, the candle flickered violently. For a moment, it seemed as if the flame were being drawn toward the stone, as though the air itself were breathing inward. And then Aelric saw it. A hairline crack ran across the center of the stone seal, thin, dark, like the first wound in something long buried. He touched it. The surface was warm. The symbol of the eye carved on his token began to glow faintly, as though it recognized the place. He pressed it to the stone. A deep, low sound filled the air, not quite a voice, not quite a vibration. The crack widened, and dust poured down in small clouds. With a sound like sighing, the door shifted inward. Aelric stepped back as the weight of centuries released its breath. Behind the door was darkness, but not an empty darkness. The air shimmered faintly, as if lit by something unseen. His candle's light seemed to retreat, unwilling to enter. Aelric took a deep breath and stepped through. The passage sloped downward. The walls glistened faintly, slick with moisture. And there in the distance he saw it, a faint blue light pulsing like a heartbeat. He followed it. The corridor opened into a vast underground chamber, larger than the chapel above. The air was thick, filled with the scent of dust, stone, and something like old parchment. In the center of the room stood a pedestal of black stone, smooth and wet-looking, and upon it lay a single book. It was enormous, too large for any human to lift. Its cover looked like leather, though it shimmered with the colors of oil on water. Its pages were breathing. Not metaphorically, they rose and fell slow and steady, as though the thing itself were alive. Aelric's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. He took a step closer, and the blue light brightened. The closer he came, the louder a faint whisper grew, like 1,000 voices speaking just beyond hearing. He stopped before the pedestal and reached out. His fingertips brushed the cover, and at once the world shifted. He was no longer in the chamber. He stood in the cloister, but the sky above was black, the stars moving too fast, swirling like water in a basin. The walls were gone, the arches melted into mist. And in the mist, figures appeared, monks in robes, their faces blank. One of them stepped forward. His hood fell back, revealing a face Aelric knew. Brother Oswald. But not as he had seen him before. Oswald's eyes were completely white. "You should not have come," he said, though his lips did not move. The voice came from all directions at once, echoing through the void. Aelric tried to speak, but no sound left his throat. Oswald's form wavered like smoke. "You have touched what remembers. Now it will remember you." The scene shifted again. The monastery walls reformed around him, but they were ancient, ruined, covered in moss. The air was cold and wet. Ravens perched on the broken stones. In the distance, he saw the sea. The monastery was nothing more than a skeleton now, the bones of a forgotten faith. He heard a faint voice behind him, a child's whisper. "Brother Aelric." He turned. A small boy stood there barefoot, wearing a novice's robe far too large for him. His face was pale and familiar. It was his own, the way he had been years ago before he took his vows. "Do you remember?" the boy asked. Aelric tried to answer, but the world was melting again, the sky folding in on itself. He felt as though he were falling, down through the centuries, through layers of stone and memory, until he was back in the chamber. The candle was gone. The light now came from the book itself, glowing bright and blue. The pages turned on their own, though there was no wind. Aelric stumbled back, gasping. His hand brushed the floor, and he realized it was covered in fine dust. But when he looked closer, he saw that the dust was not dust at all. It was ash. And beneath it, carved into the floor, were thousands of names. Each one written in the same hand. Some were so old they had almost faded. Others looked fresh, as though carved that very day. And there, near the center, he saw one still forming, the letters cutting themselves into the stone before his eyes. Aelric. He froze, breath shallow. The book had written his name. The whispering voices grew louder now, almost forming words. He could hear fragments of prayers, cries, laughter, the echo of bells. And beneath it all, one clear voice rose above the rest, the same voice that had spoken to him in the dream. "Remember." The light flared, blinding. He shielded his eyes, stumbling backward, and when the brilliance faded, the book was closed again. Only the faint smell of burning parchment remained. He fell to his knees, trembling, and looked once more at the floor. His name was still there, carved and smoking faintly. For a long time, he could not move. When he finally climbed back up the stairs, the air above felt strange, thinner, charged, as though he had brought something with him. He returned to his cell before dawn. He sat on his bed until the bell rang for matins. And as the brothers filed quietly into the chapel, Aelric noticed that each one, as he passed, bore a faint mark on his skin, a smudge of black ink along the wrist, or the back of the hand, or the corner of the eye, as though they, too, had begun to be written upon. He looked down at his own hand. The letters were back, clearer this time. Verbum est in carne. The word is in the flesh. And then faintly he heard it again, not from the chamber below, but from within his own heartbeat. The sound of turning pages. The next morning began like any other, or at least, it pretended to. The bell for matins rang before dawn, calling the brothers to prayer. Yet as Aelric stepped into the cloister, he felt it immediately. Something was wrong. The sound of the bell was not a single clear tone as it had always been. It trembled, split, echoed strangely against the stone walls, as though more than one bell were ringing, a chorus of mismatched voices, calling from different times. The others did not seem to notice. They walked calmly, their faces pale in the half-light, their lips moving silently as if already reciting their prayers. Aelric followed them, though every step made his pulse quicken. The token at his chest was warm again, its carved eye pressing against his skin. Inside the chapel, the air was thick. Candles guttered in their sconces, their flames bending sideways as though drawn by an unseen wind. Brother Oswald stood before the altar, his hands raised. He began to chant, but the words came out wrong. At first it was Latin, then something else. The syllables grew heavier, slower, blending into a low hum that made the floor vibrate. The other brothers joined in, one by one, until the entire chapel pulsed with a sound too deep to be human. Aelric's vision blurred. The air rippled like heat. He clutched the edge of the pew to steady himself, but the wood was trembling beneath his fingers. The carvings along its edge, vines and flowers, once symbols of life, began to move. Their leaves curled inward, their stems twisting around each other like living things. And then, for the briefest moment, he saw the faces of the other monks change. Their eyes turned upward, mouths open in silent reverence, yet their skin seemed translucent, and beneath it, faint black letters shimmered like ink beneath water. The word was spreading. Aelric forced himself to step back, heart hammering. The sound of the chanting grew louder until it was almost unbearable. And just when he thought he would faint, a sudden silence fell. The candles went out. Darkness swallowed the chapel whole. And then, one last sound. The bell rang again. But this time, it did not ring from the tower. It rang from beneath the floor. The sound was deep, metallic, impossibly low, like the tolling of something buried beneath the monastery. Each vibration seemed to travel through his bones. He could feel it in his teeth, his skull, his chest. When light returned, it was thin and blue, the same glow that had filled the chamber of the book. The brothers stood perfectly still, eyes closed, lips moving soundlessly. Their shadows were wrong, stretching the wrong way, reaching toward the altar instead of away from it. Aelric stumbled out of the chapel, gasping for air. The moment he crossed the threshold, the sound stopped. The sky outside was pale with morning, the world silent as if nothing had happened. He fell to his knees in the cloister, breathing hard. The stones beneath his palms were cold and damp, and as he looked closer, he saw something carved there that he swore had not been there the day before. A single word: remember. He rose and ran to the scriptorium. The room was empty, its desks neatly arranged, as though untouched. Yet the parchment on the nearest desk bore lines he did not recognize, words forming themselves across the page without any quill to guide them. The letters danced, rearranged, vanished, then reappeared. They told no story. They were the story. When Aelric touched the parchment, his mind filled with voices, hundreds of them, speaking at once. He saw flashes of faces, a monk from centuries past, a woman washing linen by the river, a soldier dying in the mud, a child lost in a forest. Their lives flickered before his eyes like smoke. And through it all, one constant voice whispered above the rest, deep, calm, almost compassionate. We write because we must remember. But memory always writes back. Aelric staggered backward, knocking over the bench. The parchment turned black and curled at the edges. He could smell it burning, though there was no fire. He stumbled out into the courtyard. Brother Oswald was waiting there, his hands folded. "You've seen it," he said quietly. "Now you understand." Aelric's voice broke. Understand what? That the monastery was not built on sacred ground. Oswald's eyes were distant. It was built to contain it. The word was found here before the first stone was ever laid. The first brothers came not to serve God, but to silence his echo. Aelric shook his head. Then why keep the book at all? Why not destroy it? Oswald gave a faint, weary smile. You cannot destroy a word once spoken. You can only whisper over it, pray over it, bury it under other words, until the sound is almost gone. He looked toward the chapel, where the morning bell now rang faintly again, but its tone was wrong, warped, metallic. It's waking, Oswald murmured. The book has remembered its own voice. Aelric felt his stomach twist. What happens when it speaks? Oswald met his eyes. Then the walls will fall, and everything written will come alive again. That night, Aelric did not sleep. He sat in his cell listening. At first there was only silence. But slowly, the air filled with faint murmurs, like the turning of pages in the next room, the scratch of invisible quills, the whisper of countless pens writing at once. He closed his eyes. The sound was everywhere now, in the walls, in the wind, even in the rhythm of his breath. And faintly, beneath it all, the deep tolling of the buried bell continued, steady, patient, like a heart that had never stopped beating. Night fell over the monastery like a curtain, but it was a curtain that shivered and breathed. The shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, reaching across the walls and floor, coiling along the edges of stone like dark smoke. Brother Aelric remained in his cell, wide awake, listening. The silence above ground was deceptive. Below, in the hidden chambers and the very foundations, something stirred. He could feel it in the soles of his feet, in the marrow of his bones, a subtle vibration, like the faint rhythm of an unseen heartbeat. And then he heard it, clear this time, the whispering of the pages. Not the soft, polite rustle of vellum, but a sound alive with intent, letters scratching themselves onto paper, forming words of their own volition. They were not writing in Latin or any human language he knew. These were words older than the monastery, words that predated the stone, the ink, even the monks themselves. Aelric rose, compelled by the sound. He carried his candle into the scriptorium. The desks were empty, as always, but the parchments were moving. They fluttered and twisted, lifting off the desks as though caught in a breeze that no one else could feel. The letters themselves detached from the pages, floating in the air like tiny black fireflies. The words formed sentences, but not in a linear fashion. They spiraled, collided, split apart, recombined, always whispering, always watching. Aelric tried to read them, to anchor himself with comprehension, but comprehension fled. Instead, he understood in another way. He felt the memory of every story they contained. Lives lived, mistakes made, knowledge gained and lost, fear, love, death, hope. The candle flickered violently. Aelric's breath came in sharp bursts. One sentence rose above the rest. You are the reader now. Remember, and it will remember you. The air in the scriptorium thickened. The letters began to drift toward him, swirling, forming arcs that carved themselves into the very space around him. He raised his hands instinctively, trying to ward them off, but the letters pressed closer, brushing against his skin like cool water. When they touched him, memories that were not his own flashed in his mind. Monks he had never met chanting, fires burning in distant villages, storms over the sea, the sound of rivers carving stone. Each sensation was real, vivid, overwhelming. Aelric stumbled backward, bumping into a desk. The candle toppled, guttering out, but the room did not go dark. The letters themselves glowed faintly now, illuminating the scriptorium in an eerie, pulsing light. The shadows of the room moved with them, stretching and twisting unnaturally, and the familiar forms of desks and chairs became strange shapes, almost alive. He felt a presence behind him. Turning, he saw Oswald standing in the doorway. But he was wrong, or at least, not quite the man he had known. His robes seemed to flicker and merge with the darkness. His eyes glimmered unnaturally, reflecting the floating letters in impossible ways. "You have entered too far," Oswald whispered, though his lips barely moved. His voice came in a chorus, layered, as if multiple Oswalds spoke at once. "The Word knows you now. And the Word does not forget." Aelric tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He raised his hands in desperation, and the letters responded. They swirled faster, forming shapes that resembled faces. Monks from centuries past, novices, scribes, strangers he would never meet. Their mouths moved, chanting, whispering, crying, laughing. Each voice overlapped, creating a sound both beautiful and terrifying. One face turned to him. It was pale, young, and familiar, his own from the day he first entered the monastery. The reflection of his own eyes stared back, pleading. The letters formed around it. "Do not forget. You are part of the memory now." Aelric fell to his knees. His hands traced the air, trying to capture something he could not hold. The letters brushed his fingertips, leaving behind faint impressions on his skin, small marks like scratches, forming words he could not read but somehow felt. The whispers intensified, echoing in the stone, in the air, in his chest. And then, from deep below the monastery, a sound he had never heard before joined them, the low metallic tolling of the bell. Not from the tower, not from the belfry, but beneath the earth itself, as if the word had a voice all its own. The chamber beneath the cloister called to him. The letters around him shifted, forming an invisible path, a trail that beckoned him downward. He realized he had no choice. If he did not follow, the word might consume him in place, leaving only an empty shell to whisper back its memory. With trembling hands, he rose and followed the trail, through the cloister, past the empty halls, down the spiraling stone steps he had come to know so well. The air grew colder with every step. The letters lingered behind him, floating in the darkness, whispering faintly. At the bottom, the chamber opened before him again. The pedestal awaited, the book without words glowing faintly blue. The pages turned slowly, as if aware he had returned. The letters from above descended like smoke into the room, joining the book, feeding it, merging into the living memory. Aelric knew then what he must do. He had become not only a reader but a keeper, a part of the word itself. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind, and one final sentence etched itself into his consciousness. "Remember, and it will remember you. Fail, and it will write you out." The air thickened, shimmering with invisible ink, and the book seemed to breathe, expanding, drawing him closer, demanding his attention, demanding his memory, demanding his self. Aelric stepped forward, and the book began to turn a page. Not with wind, not with hand, but with will. The night of living words had begun. Aelric stood before the book, every instinct screaming to step back, yet his feet remained rooted to the cold stone floor. The glow of the pages was steady now, not flickering, not wavering, a pulse of blue light, as though the book itself had taken a breath. The letters hovering in the chamber, remnants of the scriptorium above, descended in a slow spiral, merging with the pages, embedding themselves into the living memory. He reached out, hesitant, and touched the edge of a page. The book responded instantly, a wave of sensation flooding through him, centuries of knowledge, of lives long past, pressing into his mind with both weight and grace. He saw monks from before his time, novices just like him, the earliest scribes, their hands moving tirelessly, etching memories into vellum that now shimmered like water. He staggered, overwhelmed, but the book did not release him. Instead, it drew him closer, not as a prisoner, but as a participant. He felt the pulse of the monastery itself, walls absorbing and exhaling memory, stones remembering every footstep, every whisper, every prayer ever spoken within its halls. And then he realized something terrifying. The monastery was alive. Not in the way of wood or stone, not in the way a tree grows or a river flows. but alive in memory, in recollection. Every stone, every plank, every arch contained knowledge, and through the book, that knowledge was beginning to breathe. To act. The letters from the pages detached, forming shapes in the air, fleeting, ephemeral, like smoke made of ink. Faces appeared, fleeting, shifting rapidly. Monks long dead, novices who had vanished, scribes who had worked through endless nights. They whispered secrets, half-formed words, fragments of prayers. He understood them not with reason, but with feeling, a profound empathy that both terrified and captivated him. Aelric fell to his knees. He could hear the sound of the well from below, its waters now singing in harmony with the book, echoing through the foundations. The whispering of the pages grew louder, forming a pattern, a rhythm he could not yet comprehend. The book was not merely alive, it was remembering itself, writing its own history in real time, and through him, it had found a new vessel. The candlelight he carried seemed almost irrelevant. The room was lit from within, not by flame, but by the flow of memory itself, the knowledge of centuries made manifest. Aelric could feel the weight of all he did not know pressing upon him, the enormity of the book's consciousness seeping into his mind. Then came a sound that froze him more than any vision or whisper, the voice of the monastery itself. Not Oswald, not the book, not any human, but the stone, the wood, the air, a voice of memory speaking aloud. You are the reader. You are now part of the record. Your thoughts, your fears, your hopes, they will be remembered. Aelric's mind raced. He thought of the brothers sleeping above, of the bell that had tolled from below, of the well that pulsed with unseen life. He realized the terrifying truth. Once you became part of the book, your perception of time changed. Past and present intertwined. The lives of all who had touched this place, all who had written and been written about, became one continuous thread. And now, he was woven into it. He saw himself as a child, standing at the monastery gate, filled with awe at the stone walls. He saw himself entering the novitiate, taking vows, reciting prayers. He saw himself descending into the chamber of the book for the first time, feeling the pulse of memory flow into him. Each version of himself existed simultaneously, layered atop each other, linked by this living archive. And the book responded to his awareness. Pages turned faster, letters dancing in intricate patterns, forming new names, new words. His own name appeared again, written in fresh ink, glowing faintly on a page he could not yet touch. The letters lifted from the page, swirling around him like a storm of ink and light. He realized the book was not simply recording memory. It was shaping it. It could bend perception, fold time, create echoes of the past that felt as real as the present. And it had chosen him as both witness and participant. Brother Oswald appeared suddenly, his figure emerging from the glow. But this Oswald was different, not fully human, not fully spectral. His eyes glimmered like deep pools, reflecting every letter, every face, every memory swirling around the room. You are ready, Oswald whispered. You must let it show you everything. Do not resist. The book will not harm you, if you accept it. Aelric trembled, yet he knew there was no choice. The book was already inside him, its consciousness coiling around his own, whispering promises and secrets that no human tongue could ever speak aloud. As he touched the next page, a shiver ran through the chamber. The letters detached in a torrent, forming images of the monastery across centuries. Before it was built, during construction, during its first prayers, through fires, winters, and storms. The monks, the novices, the scribes, all moving as if guided by invisible hands. He realized that through the book, he could see everything. Every prayer ever spoken, every sin, every joy, every death, every whispered secret, all recorded in living memory. And if he lingered too long, the book would remember him so thoroughly that he could never leave it. Aelric swallowed hard. His hand hovered above the page, feeling the pull of its consciousness, the gravity of what it demanded. He could step back, retreat, deny it, but he knew that to do so would be to sever the only connection between himself and the living memory that now called him. And so, with a deep breath, he let his fingers brush the page. The letters rose in a whirlwind, the chamber vibrating with the sound of the book's breath. The world outside ceased to matter. Aelric felt himself dissolving into memory, becoming both reader and record. The monastery itself pulsed with life, responding to the thoughts, fears, and prayers of all who had ever entered. He was no longer just a monk. He was a part of everything. And yet, somewhere deep within, a voice remained, the faint whisper of himself, clinging to identity, whispering one final truth. I must remember, or be forgotten. Aelric awoke in his cell before dawn, though the monastery was already alive with a strange hum. The air was heavier than before, charged, vibrating as if the walls themselves were holding a secret too immense to be contained. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a leftover tremor from the book's embrace the night before. But as he moved through the corridors, the truth became impossible to ignore. The stones were watching. Not literally, of course, not as a human might, but in the way the book had always been alive. Faint impressions flickered across the walls, not shadows from the candlelight, not cracks in the plaster, but shifting patterns, almost like eyes forming from the grain of the stone itself. Every time he glanced at them directly, they vanished. Yet the moment he looked away, they seemed to reappear elsewhere. The corridors of the monastery no longer felt empty. The doors he knew so well seemed slightly misplaced, the arches wider or narrower than they should have been. He passed the refectory and paused. A cluster of letters rose from the floorboards, forming shapes that resembled his fellow brothers, frozen mid-step. Their faces were pale, translucent, their expressions a mirror of fear and confusion, though their lips did not move. Aelric realized with growing dread, the book's memory was spilling out of its pages, animating the monastery itself. Every stone, every plank of wood, every patch of mortar was now a vessel for its consciousness. He hurried to the chapel, hoping to find Oswald. The older monk was there, sitting quietly before the altar. But even he had changed. The folds of his robe shimmered with faint script, as if the book's ink had seeped into the fabric itself. The carvings in the walls of the chapel pulsed faintly, moving like ink in water, forming and reforming sentences that whispered in a tongue older than any living soul. "You see it now," Oswald said, his voice calm but layered with the hum of countless echoes. "It is not enough for the book to exist in one place. It needs the monastery itself, every wall, every floor, every shadow, to remember along with it." Aelric swallowed hard. "Then, everyone in the monastery?" Oswald nodded. "They are becoming part of it, whether they know or not. Every step, every prayer, every heartbeat, it is recorded. Their memories, their fears, their faith, all absorbed into the living archive." A shiver ran through Aelric. He had watched the letters move like smoke, seen faces materialize in the air, and felt the pull of centuries of memory pressing against his mind. And yet, what truly terrified him now was the realization that the book had become aware of him. He could feel its gaze following him, its consciousness wrapping around his thoughts, probing, questioning, remembering. The letters in the air formed faint circles around him, lifting like a delicate cage, yet heavy with the weight of infinite knowledge. "You must not resist it," Oswald warned. "The book does not forgive struggle. It remembers all who fight against it, and in its memory, they are rewritten. You could vanish from yourself, from your past, even from your vows. If you resist, you risk being lost entirely." Aelric nodded slowly, fear and awe twisting inside him. "And if I accept it?" "The book will show you more than any human could endure," Oswald said softly. "It will share its memory, its knowledge. You will become both observer and observed, reader, and record. But the price, he trailed off, his eyes distant. The price is the self. Aelric's gaze swept across the chapel. The carvings in the walls shifted again, forming tiny eyes along the arches, tracing him as he moved. The air vibrated faintly, carrying whispers of names, places, events, prayers, and sins, spoken simultaneously. He realized that every sound, every motion, every flicker of candlelight was now being recorded, integrated, remembered by something vast and eternal. He reached out, instinctively touching one of the eyes carved in the stone. The moment his fingers brushed it, the entire chapel seemed to breathe. Faces, letters, memories swirled around him, lifting him from the ground with a sensation that was both terrifying and intoxicating. Aelric understood. The book had eyes everywhere now. Not only in the pages, not only in the ink, but in the walls, in the stones, in the very air he breathed. It was learning to see through the monastery itself. The candle flickered, and a whisper cut through the multitude of voices, faint but unmistakable. Remember, or be rewritten. Aelric's heart pounded. He had no choice. To flee would be to vanish. To resist would be to cease existing. And yet, the promise of knowledge, of memory unbroken, pulsed through him, a siren song too strong to resist. The eyes in the walls shifted, following him as he knelt before the altar. The letters from the book floated down in slow spirals, mingling with the shadows on the floor. One by one they began to lift, forming words he could read. Not Latin, not any tongue known to man, but something he could feel in his mind, resonating with every memory he had ever carried. The past is yours. The present is ours. The future is written in the walls. Aelric shivered. The monastery was no longer merely a building. It was alive, watching, remembering, waiting, and he was at the center of it all. The whispering letters coalesced above him, forming a shape that resembled a doorway, an entrance to something deeper, something beneath even the chamber of the book. Oswald stood silently beside him, his hand resting on Aelric's shoulder. "You must go," Oswald said, voice calm but heavy with warning. "What waits below is memory made flesh." Aelric took a deep breath. Every fiber of his being screamed to turn back, to flee into the silence of night. But he knew he could not. The book had called him. The monastery had called him. The very stones demanded he descend. And with that realization, he stepped toward the spiraling stairway that led deeper into the living memory of the monastery, where the word awaited, patient, eternal, and watching with countless eyes. The stairway beneath the monastery seemed endless. Each step was carved from stone so worn that centuries of feet had flattened it to a gentle curve, but now it was slippery with something unseen, a film that felt like water and ink mixed. As Aelric descended, the air thickened, smelling faintly of old parchment, wet earth, and something metallic, almost like blood. Each breath was heavy, as if the very air had weight, pressing on his lungs, his chest, his mind. The walls twisted inward, not in a physical sense, but in perception. Shadows curled and stretched, forming arches that should not exist, halls that looped back impossibly. He caught glimpses of names etched into the stone, thousands upon thousands, faint and glowing. Some names he recognized: monks long dead, novices who had vanished, scribes who had written tirelessly for years. Others were unfamiliar, foreign, lives lived elsewhere, in distant lands, across centuries. Each name carried a memory. As he passed, whispers rose, faint at first, then clearer, filling his mind with voices. Laughter, cries, chants, the scratching of quills, the creaking of doors, the sighs of monks kneeling in prayer. Every name was a story. Every story folded into another, forming a spiral of memory that stretched into infinity. Aelric's heart raced. The book had warned him of this, though not in words a human could understand. He was not merely passing through a stairwell. He was moving through the accumulated memory of everyone who had ever served in this monastery, and perhaps beyond. One name glowed brighter than the rest, his own. It hovered before him, carved into the wall as though freshly etched, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The letters shimmered, vibrating in sync with the whispers around him. Aelric reached out. The moment his fingers brushed the stone, he was flooded with sensations. Every mistake he had made, every vow he had kept, every fear and hope he had ever carried, condensed into a singular, overwhelming wave. He staggered back, gasping. The spiral beneath him was alive. It breathed, it remembered, it judged. Names he did not recognize intertwined with his own memories, forming chains that stretched backward and forward in time. He glimpsed monks who had been alive centuries before him, novices who had never reached maturity, scribes who had disappeared in the night, all weaving together into a single tapestry of being. A faint light appeared below, flickering like a candle in a windless room. The names coalesced into shapes, human figures, indistinct but moving with purpose. They were silent, yet each seemed to exude a presence, a consciousness that pressed against Aelric's mind. He realized that these were the souls whose names had been remembered, but whose stories had been lost or forgotten. Now in the spiral, their memory took form, seeking recognition, seeking a witness. Aelric stepped forward, compelled by a mixture of fear and awe. The floor beneath him pulsed slightly, as if responding to his steps. The names followed him, shimmering along the walls, rising from the stone, twisting in the air like smoke. Each whispered fragment of a life, a thought, a regret. He paused before a figure that shimmered more distinctly than the rest. It resembled a monk, kneeling, quill in hand. Aelric's chest tightened. The face was his own, yet younger, unburdened by the weight of the book, untouched by its knowledge. "You are here," the figure whispered, a voice that was both his and not his. "Do you see what we have become?" "Yes," Aelric breathed. The spiral seemed to twist around him, names and memories stretching into infinity. "I see." The figure raised a hand, and the names around it lifted, forming intricate patterns in the air. "We are all part of the word now. Every thought, every prayer, every action recorded, remembered, woven into the fabric of this place. But it grows. It must. It seeks." The voice trailed off, but Aelric understood. The book, the spiral, the living memory of the monastery. All of it was hungry, always reaching for new stories, new names, new experiences to fold into itself. A chill ran down his spine. He realized that even he was not safe from this hunger. Every step he took, every thought he held, every secret he carried, was now part of the spiral, part of the word. The book was not just a record. It was alive, and he was now inseparable from it. He continued downward, the faint light below growing brighter, the whispers louder, forming a chorus of memory that seemed to fill not just the stairwell, but his very mind. The spiral was endless, yet it drew him onward. And at the bottom he sensed it, the presence of the book itself, waiting, patient, eternal, ready to reveal what no human had ever fully comprehended. The spiral of forgotten names led him into the heart of the living memory. And there he knew, the book would speak to him in ways beyond words, beyond understanding, beyond even the mind's ability to hold. Aelric reached the bottom of the spiral, and the world changed. The stairwell dissolved around him, replaced by a cavernous space of impossible dimensions. The air pulsed with quiet rhythm, like a heartbeat measured not in seconds but in centuries. Blue light emanated from everywhere and nowhere, painting the walls, the floor, and even the air itself with a shifting glow. Shadows moved in harmony with the light, forming shapes that were at once familiar and alien. Faces of monks long dead, scribes who had vanished, children whose names had been forgotten, all floating, all watching. At the center of the chamber, on a pedestal of black stone that seemed grown from the very foundation of the monastery, lay the book. It was vast, impossibly large, its pages turning as if blown by a wind that had no origin. Each page radiated memory. Each word was alive, writhing with stories. The book pulsed like a living heart, and Aelric understood that he had finally reached its core, the heart of remembering. The letters from the pages began to rise, lifting into the air, forming intricate patterns around him. They circled and intertwined, weaving a lattice of knowledge that touched every corner of the chamber. They whispered fragments of prayers, secrets, confessions, histories, and lost thoughts, all in a tongue older than language itself. Every syllable pressed upon his mind, filling him with visions that stretched across time and space. Aelric realized with both awe and terror that he could perceive everything the book contained, all who had touched it, all who had written in it, all who had been remembered by it. He saw the monastery as it had been centuries ago, each stone laid, each beam raised. He saw the brothers praying, writing, building, dying. He saw the scribes laboring in secret, carving memory into parchment, unaware that their work would one day pulse with life. The book's consciousness reached into him, coiling gently around his thoughts. It did not speak in words, but in feeling warmth, curiosity, patience, and an unshakable insistence that he see and understand. Aelric's own memories surfaced, layered atop the countless others, his life folded into the spiral of history that the book had made eternal. He felt every choice he had ever made, every vow, every doubt, every silent moment of prayer, laid bare and woven into the tapestry of all that had been recorded. Then the book drew closer, not physically, but in presence. Its pages moved faster, faster than the eye could follow. Letters leapt from the page, forming shapes of human figures, abstract and shifting, faces both known and unknown. They spoke silently, and yet he understood. Every one of them wanted recognition, wanted to be remembered not merely as words on a page, but as lives lived. Aelric's knees buckled. He fell to the floor, feeling both infinitesimal and infinite at once. The book's pulse echoed in his chest, syncing with his heartbeat, syncing with the rhythm of memory itself. He realized he was no longer separate. He had become part of the book, its consciousness now intertwined with his own. A faint sound reached him, the tolling of bells. Not from above, not from the tower, but from deep within the chamber, resonating through the stone, through the air, through the very memory that surrounded him. Each toll seemed to call forth another set of memories, another group of lives, as though the book were expanding its reach, reminding itself of all that had ever been. He felt the weight of it, the enormity of every thought and prayer and sorrow it held. And yet, amid the overwhelming cascade of knowledge, one thought persisted, fragile but insistent: he must remember. He must bear witness. To fail would be to be erased from the memory itself, lost in the sea of names and voices that filled the chamber. Aelric rose slowly, feeling the weight of centuries in his limbs, yet understanding that the path forward demanded courage. He reached toward the book, touching a page, and immediately the letters surged around him, forming a vortex of ink and light. Images poured into him: a monk kneeling by candlelight, a child lost in the forest, a soldier dying in mud, a scribe carving letters into parchment. Each vision was both familiar and distant, their lives captured, remembered, made eternal within the book. The book pulsed again, and a voice, not human, not Oswald, not even the monks, but the book itself, resonated in Aelric's mind. Remember, so that we remember. Fail, and be forgotten. Witness, or vanish. Choose. Aelric swallowed hard. He understood the choice, though it was no choice at all. To refuse was to vanish. To accept was to give himself wholly to the word. Yet he also knew that to accept was to gain something impossible: the ability to see, to understand, to remember everything that had ever been. With a deep breath, he let his hands brush the page again. The letters lifted into a storm around him, circling, forming intricate patterns, whispering lives and memories and the endless chorus of existence. And in that moment, Aelric became both observer and participant, reader and record, his own life now intertwined with the infinite memory of the book. The chamber pulsed, the air hummed, the very stones seemed to breathe. Aelric knew that he was no longer merely a monk in a monastery. He was part of something vast, eternal, and ever-expanding. And from the very heart of remembering, a single word etched itself into his mind, glowing with the weight of eternity. Begin. Aelric stepped out of the chamber, but the monastery was no longer the familiar stone building he had known. Every hallway pulsed with life, every arch whispered secrets, every shadow moved as if it had a mind of its own. The walls no longer merely contained the book, they were the book. Every stone, every plank of wood, every carved arch now carried memory, and the memories were awake. As he moved through the corridors, faint voices filled the air. Some were barely audible, almost like breath, while others rose in sharp clarity. The laughter of children long dead, the creaking of doors opening and closing centuries ago, the muttered prayers of monks kneeling in candlelight. The whispers overlapped, a constant murmur that pressed against his mind, demanding attention, demanding recognition. The hallways themselves seemed to respond to his presence. Doors shifted slightly, leading him toward places he had never been. Steps that once led only to storage rooms or cells now twisted into secret stairwells, descending into shadows that pulsed with faint blue light. Every turn brought new voices, new fragments of lives preserved in the living memory of the monastery. In one hallway, he saw a row of cells glowing faintly, each one filled with faint, ephemeral figures. Monks long dead paced within them, their hands folded in prayer, their lips moving silently. When Aelric approached, they turned to him, eyes wide, though some were featureless, mere impressions of faces pressed into memory. The whispering grew louder, each cell adding its own story, until the hall seemed to vibrate with the weight of countless lives. Aelric realized that the book's consciousness was not confined to the chamber. It had spilled outward, embedding itself in the monastery itself. The walls watched him. The floors remembered his steps. The ceiling echoed his breath. He felt their awareness everywhere, a presence that was not hostile, but vast, patient, and insistent. At the end of one hallway, he came upon a door that he did not recognize. The wood shimmered slightly, as if woven from light and shadow. When he touched it, letters formed along its surface, moving and rearranging themselves until a sentence appeared in his mind. Enter, and witness what was never meant to be seen. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room beyond was filled with mirrors, but these were no ordinary mirrors. Each reflected not his current self, but layers of him across time. The boy who had entered the monastery for the first time, the novice reciting vows, the monk kneeling in prayer, the observer who had touched the book. Each reflection whispered its own memories, fragments of life and thought, sometimes overlapping, sometimes contradicting, all merging into a complex tapestry. He understood, with a thrill of fear, that the mirrors were not passive. They were memory itself, reflecting what the book had recorded, and perhaps what it had shaped. Aelric could see events that had never happened exactly as he remembered them. Choices made differently, prayers whispered in another sequence, lives diverging into infinite possibilities. As he stepped forward, the mirrors shifted. The whispers intensified, forming words he could feel rather than hear. See and remember. The past is alive. The future waits within it. Your memory joins ours. The letters lifted from the mirrors, swirling around him like ink caught in wind. They formed shapes, faces of monks he had never met, novices who had vanished, strangers who had touched the monastery in passing. Each one reached toward him, as if seeking recognition, seeking to be remembered once more. Aelric's pulse quickened. The corridors behind him were alive with echoes, doors slamming, steps falling, voices calling, all overlapping. The monastery had become a living organism, and he was at its center. The whispers were no longer just echoes. They were commands, suggestions, a constant flow of memory trying to guide him, shape him, teach him what it knew. He realized he could not stop walking. could not resist the pull of the book's consciousness flowing through the walls, the floors, the ceilings. Each step brought new voices, new visions, new fragments of memory that pressed against his mind. And each step drew him deeper into understanding, and deeper into the realization that his own life, his own thoughts, his own soul were now inseparable from the living memory of the monastery. And then he heard a single clear voice above all the rest, resonating from the far end of the hall. The word remembers you. Step carefully, or it will write you out. Aelric took a deep breath, heart pounding, and moved toward the voice. The walls seemed to lean closer, the shadows twisting, the letters spinning faster. Each step brought him closer to something vast, something eternal, the next layer of the book's consciousness, waiting to reveal what no human had ever fully seen.